Hi guys, welcome to the final video, part 2 on the UK's evolving human landscape. And we're going to be looking at rural areas today. So it's the last little bit of what we need to look at. So I'm going to run through this really quickly. It's all just kind of taken from the textbook. I'll go over some key terms with you. We'll have a little look at some case studies. I'll recommend a bit of viewing if you've got time to do it. So we finished the last video looking at urban areas and differences and disparities in the richer outer suburbs and the poorer kind of inner city areas, etc., on the deprivation that changed across the city. We're going to be looking now at two types of rural area. Okay, so the first one is accessible rural. Okay, and that is in the book it talks about Turling, but where I'm from, in Sittingbourne in Kent, it could more or less be that. We're not a village or anything. We're a little bit bigger, but we are, you know, a possible commute into London. We're only like 50 minutes away on the fast train on HS1. So Turling is in the rural urban fringe, and if you remember, that's where the countryside meets the city, and it's called accessible rural because people will live there and commute into London. So you end up with a kind of codependency. And the textbook talks about how, and quite a lot of the time the questions talk about how are the two places dependent on each other. So Turling needs London because it needs to provide jobs for the people, and London needs Turling because it needs the workers. Also, London needs Turling because those people are commuters, so they will live in Turling, which is in Essex, and then they will commute into London and spend their money there. So there's this kind of codependency going on. Also, Turling, or London needs Turling because Turling's got lower prices for its housing. So you can't really live in London because it's very expensive. So people commute because it's only like 30 minutes, 50 minutes on the train. So that is our idea of accessible rural near London and how they are dependent on the city. So the city provides jobs, the city provides services, the city provides shops, and places to, you know, go and spend your money, etc. And then London needs Turling because it provides it with a huge amount of people who will live in Turling because the accommodation is cheaper, the housing's a lot cheaper than living in London. So that is our accessible rural and how the two of them are dependent excuse me, on each other. Now, obviously the rural urban fringe is the area where the town meets the city, and a sleeper town or a dormitory town, as it's called, is just as what we said, is a town that's close to the city, close enough that you can commute, essentially. So if you live, you know, 40-50 an hour just outside London, the chances are that you're a dormitory town or a sleeper town. It's the same thing. So people sleep there and then work in London. The downside of that for those peripheral areas is that quite often people won't spend their money there. They will use the services and the goods in London. So you often get places like that where they have like post offices shut down and services closed down because people aren't using them. So it is a little bit negative, if you see what I mean, as well for those areas. So they don't really like expanding. So it does cause some conflict because if an area gets bigger and you've got mostly commuters living there, it kind of destroys kind of the community. And a lot of people don't feel like they're from those areas, so you get a lot of like disconnection between people and a lot of conflict between the new people and the other people who lived there before. So that is what we would call counter-urbanisation as well, where people move out of the city into the countryside surrounding it. So in this day and age, because we've got the internet, because we've got good transport links, because we can work from home now post-COVID, a lot of these dormitory towns and sleeper towns and places around the cities are actually growing because we've got this idea of counter-urbanisation. But it's not always good because obviously these places were rural, and now they're not, so people don't like that. And also, like I said, you don't tend to have like people spending their money there because they spend it in London. So that is that. Okay, so they do depend on each other. Now, the next lot that we've got is kind of like more remote areas. So I've put accessible rural here. It's a bit in the middle, Devon. It's like, it's kind of between accessible and remote, really. It's obviously east of Cornwall, so it's to the west of the UK, but it has got decent rail links and road links. So especially eastern Devon it's only like, you know, an hour and a half or something from London. It's probably a bit longer than that, but around about. So you've got a lot of decentralisation, and the textbook talks about the Met Office, which has moved to Exeter, which is in Devon, because you've got the M5, you've got Exeter Airport, you've got the A30, etc. And it's quite a nice area to live in, because it's, you know, on the south coast and it's quite rural. And so you've got the Met Office, which is actually like moved people out. We talked in the last video, I think, about like how the BBC had moved people to Salford. Well, another way to try and like encourage people to move out of London and to encourage businesses to move elsewhere is decentralisation, and that's what the Met Office has done as well. It's realised that it can have a location that's cheaper rent, easy to get to, cheaper housing, the people have a nice quality of life, etc. So they've moved out there. So that's why they've moved there. So it says it's only 3 kilometres from Exeter Airport, daily flights to London, Northern Ireland and Europe, 42 train services to London daily, and the fastest is 2 hours. And the Met Office is only half a mile from the M5 junction. So it's really, really accessible. Okay, so that has brought pros and cons, like we said before. What it tends to do is it puts pressure on the population and on the services, because we've got more people moving in. So the same thing would happen in Turling, like we said before, is that increased population puts pressure on services, puts pressure on schools, on healthcare. It puts pressure on housing, obviously, and house prices can end up going up, which is not good for local people or younger people who want to get on a property market. And it puts pressure on leisure and recreation, because obviously those areas have now got thousands of people living there, rather than, you know, a couple of hundred or whatever, or tens of thousands rather than thousands. So there's pros and cons to it, obviously. So it's good for the people moving in, but it's not so good for the environment, and it's not so good for the local people as well, because it puts pressure on services, etc. Okay, so that was Devon. So the final case study that we've got is a nice easy one. That's Cornwall. So Cornwall is remote rural. Okay, so Cornwall is, we've been on a few field trips. No, it isn't. That's Devon. It's still like really hard to get to. It takes hours to get there. I mean, I went to Scotland over half term, and it took 4 hours, 20 minutes to get from London to Edinburgh, which is like hundreds and hundreds of miles. Is it 500 miles? It might be that much, it might be more. But if I go to Cornwall, it's probably going to take me 5 or 6 hours to get there, and it's not even half the distance. So it's really inaccessible. There's no big motorways, there's no big A roads, there's very limited in the way of airports, etc. It's very rural, communications aren't great, broadband is there, but obviously, you know, there's some issues with it, etc. So it is a problem. Now, Cornwall, similar to the north of England, relied in the past on primary industry, in particular kind of quarrying, fishing, agriculture, China clay, tin mining, that kind of stuff. So fishing, that kind of thing. So it employed a lot of people in the primary industry. And then with the global shift and globalization, obviously it's cheaper for us to import stuff from abroad. So we get China clay from abroad, we import paper from abroad, we've got tin and metals from abroad, which are much cheaper because we get them from China or South Africa or Australia. Fish, obviously, we can buy that from abroad as well, in our supermarkets, etc. So it's gone through a decline, Cornwall, and as a consequence, it's not like idyllic, like people think of the rural idyll, and how like these places are like beautiful and everybody like loves living there and that kind of thing. And it is nice in places, but it's also got huge amounts of deprivation. So obviously there's issues with that, and West Cornwall is one of the most deprived areas in the whole of the UK, which might come as a surprise to some of you who maybe not from there, because you only ever go on holiday, but you only ever go on holiday to kind of the nice places. And remember, tourism is only seasonal, it's low pay, it's low skilled, etc. So it doesn't really improve the place, obviously. There's issues with doctors, there's issues with transport, there's issues with getting to those doctors. It's got an ageing population because people are moving out. We talked in the last video about population change in the UK. So people don't want to kind of live there, the younger people don't want to live there because there's no opportunities for them, etc. So there's lots and lots of problems. Okay, so you've got a couple of hospitals, you've got some doctor surgeries, but they're under pressure. And the index of multiple deprivation, which is obviously where we look at kind of income, employment, health, education, housing, like we looked at in London, we can use these same indicators in Cornwall. And the indicators are, most of them are kind of like showing that the area is quite deprived. So house prices can be quite high because of second homes. Education can be quite poor. health services are quite poor, access to transport and everything is quite poor, especially if you're older. So there's lots of issues in these areas of Cornwall, and obviously, as it says that it's gone into decline because it had primary jobs. It's hard to get tertiary jobs to go there. Devon's found that it can because it's a little bit more accessible, but it's very hard for the government to try to encourage businesses to move to places, because at the end of the day, governments are not charities, they're businesses. Businesses are not charities, they're businesses, and they want to make money. So it's very difficult for the government to try and definitely get people and businesses to go there and get FDI, etc., because they want to go where there's skilled people and there's good access to transport links, which is London and the southeast. It's hard enough to try and get people to go to the north of England where there is better accessibility, because the trains only take, Liverpool takes just over 2 hours to get to Liverpool, 4 hours and 20 minutes up to Scotland, etc. So that kind of thing. Right, so that's that. So what have we done here? There's lots of things in place, and we've got the Eden Project, farm diversification, increased broadband, improving the environment, and tourism. Now that's all in the book. Okay, so you just need to run through the pros and cons of these. And my last little thing is I would recommend watching the Simon Reeve video, which is on Cornwall. It's on BBC iPlayer, and it's a really, really good watch. It's about an hour, but it talks about everything that we've talked about. So hopefully that helps you. The 8 marker may well be on this bit, the pros and cons of this. So some of them are good and some of them are poor. So you can't really make people move to these places, so that's the downside. But the environment's nice to live there, if you see what I mean. So that's my final video. Good luck to you in your exam in paper 2, and yeah, see you soon.